used to call me Crazy Joe, but now they can call me Batman.
Well, welcome back once again to the Necro Zoo. I am Bones. And in this one, let's go ahead and add one more Megafig to my McFarlane DC Multiverse collection. Now today we will take a look at Kalibak. Now this is the latest Megafig from McFarlane. I did pick this up by ordering it from Target. Now he is a standard release, so eventually he will be up for sale all over the place. But he's a pretty beefy looking boy. We will take a closer look at him, compare him to the older Mattel stuff, and then I did have some fun with him. Now he does look pretty brutal in the packaging, but let's go ahead and take a closer look at it. But first, he does come with your standard black DC Multiverse stand. Now these are not really needed, especially for this figure, but sometimes they do come in useful. He also comes with his data file card. On the front you do have some source material. It does say this is from the Dark Side War. And on the back you do have some information. Now of course Kalibak is the actual son of Darkseid on Apocalypse. Another son of his, but he's actually like an adopted son, is Orion. And then of course that takes us all into the mythology of the Kirby Fourth World and Darkseid, Apocalypse, all the characters from there. And of course the alien technology that rules that planet. The boom tubes and so forth. Actually a pretty cool storyline if you dig into it. So we'll go ahead and add this to the collection. Now he does come with one accessory, and that is his mace. I think this is called the Beta Mace or something like that. It does have a sort of spiky knuckle duster on it, and this is pretty much his signature weapon that usually comes with Kalibak. It's in a pretty cool, more copper bronze color, and it pretty much matches the armor that he wears on his body. So pretty cool. Nice to have an accessory for a Megafig. But let's go ahead and take a closer look at it. Now, first impressions, I have to say, really heavy figure. This one is, built tough. Pretty much the opposite of Mongol, the other Megafig that we received. That's kind of one of those outer space villains. This guy definitely has some heft to him, which is always nice. And the first thing to notice on him, of course, is all the detailed sculpt work. You could just see it from here without even getting a close-up look. All the intricate sculpt work, all the attention to detail, all the added textures, it's just all there in the sculpt from McFarlane. Now, of course, per usual, it's not going to have the best paint, especially on the body. But one place that they did go out of their way to add some paint is the head sculpt. Now, taking a look at the head sculpt. Beautiful head sculpt with a ton of detail here. Now, we have to understand that this version is from a more modern version of Kalibak from the Dark Side War. So it's not going to have your traditional look the way like a Superpowers version or an older, 80s version of Kalibak. This is a more modern, detailed, pumped up version of Kalibak. One thing you don't usually see in the older versions of Kalibak is, of course, that nose ring that he has. Beautiful hair sculpt on this guy. Kind of weird to say because he is pretty brutal to look at. And then those whited out eyes, or like yellowish eyes, just give him that creep factor, that intimidation factor that is always appreciated. Now let's take a look at the articulation. He can look down. Now, first of all, he has a lot of movement in the head. They put a really long peg in this one, so his head is kind of raised up. It doesn't sit so low on his neck. So that gives it a lot more range and swivel and, movement. But you're going to lose something with all this hair which is he can't really look up. Now you can kind of get him to look a little bit more than eye level, but it's still not very much. But he does have right to left. And then of course he could tilt his head for some intimidation factor. And like I said, a lot of range here in this head, even though it is limited when you want to look up. Let's go ahead and move down. Taking a look at his bandolero that he has. Cool alien glyphs that are on this. And then the attention to detail, you look real deep into the plastic. It actually has kind of like a hexagon or a polygon like pattern in the plastic, even below where all these like alien writings are at. So that's a cool attention to detail, an added little detail from McFarlane. Once you get into his suit, I mean, he has a certain texture on one part, and then you move down and it has a completely different grain to it. It's just awesome work from McFarlane. Going down into the belt that also has a bunch of cool sculpt work. So this is just a beautiful figure from McFarlane with a lot of sculpt work that just goes above and beyond, you know, from your standard figure. $40 for this guy is a steal for the presence that he's going to bring on your shelf. Let's take a look at the waist articulation. You do have side to side. You do have that full tilt-a-whirl, so you could rock his body around. You do have a lower waist swivel, but no upper chest swivel, but you still can twist him, get him in some cool poses. Now, he doesn't necessarily have too much crunch, but it is there. But if you compound it in a total with the whole waist articulation, he actually can lean back and lean forward pretty well, especially for a big bulky figure like this guy. So you know that works for me. Now he does have this big shoulder pauldron on his left shoulder, so let's take a look at the right side first. You do have like that socket joint for the shoulder, and his garment does flex to give you some movement there. You do have up and down, front to back, no bicep swivel, and then you do have a single jointed elbow. But the cool thing about these mega figs is how you have that elbow swivel, which actually gives you more range than you would think and allows you to move his arm in different positions. Now on the other side, he does have that shoulder guard. Beautiful detail on the skin. It's just like a gnarly arm, and then some bands here. Now on the left side, you do have a gripping hand to hold his different weapons, and then you do have the wrist articulation and swivel, as well as you do on the fist side. You do have that front to back swivel, the hinging, but you just don't have that other point of articulation that usually McFarlane figures do have. Pretty easy to get him in a T-pose, even with that shoulder guard. Now this will not allow you to get both arms above the head, but the articulation is there, and then you even have a little bit of twist with that elbow swivel. Add a little bit more dexterity. Let's take a look at the lower legs. Now this guy does have some cool thigh swivel. More than usual, and that's rather interesting because I think what this does, of course, you know, is add to the articulation of the foot, where you could move the foot from side to side without actually having a thigh cut in there. So this kind of takes the placement of any boot cut or thigh cut, because you could still swivel the foot from right to left like that. Of course, he can kick up and kick back with the best of them. Now don't be afraid to move the rubber, because when you put it back, all the rubber goes back to its original position. You can cock out the knee, bend it. He does have a swivel here on the knee, and then you do have the hip swivel that McFarlane figures usually have. Straighten them out. You got up and down at the ankle. And then here's where that hip twist comes into play, because you don't have like a side to side boot swivel, but you do have rocker. And to take the place of that swivel is actually the hip, is what allows you to move the boot from side to side. And then of course you do have toe articulation. Now before we go, let's take a look at the lower body. Tons of detail, tons of sculpt work. Just look at all of the different textures that this figure has. It's just awesome. Like his shorts have a texture, and then moving down, all his like skin have all these kind of bumps and wrinkles, and then going down into the boots, even the boots have their own texture, which, you know, it's like a little microbead texture that just adds that little flair that is always cool to see from McFarlane. Taking a look at him from the bottom, no tread, but he does have some identifying marks. Moving up the back, more detailed sculpt work into the back of his tunic, into that awesome belt with all the added detail, and then the back of his bandolero. And another thing you can look at is the grain that is on his costume right here. You could really see it. It's kind of like one tone has kind of like it's kind of weird to say it, but like kind of like the way your fingertips have. And then the cloth, the other part of the cloth is just more like a little leather grain. And then even the section part up here has texture. So all in all, a lot of cool detail. I mean, this is like, basically this is like an awesome statue that you have in your hand, but that you can actually put in different poses. Whenever you feel like you get tired of them being in one pose, you can go ahead and switch them to another pose. You can add another figure to put him like in a diorama with him. I mean, these are just like super articulated figures that give like that high-end detail and sculpt. Now, here's a tip. You could follow the way that they like did a wash on the face. It has a little bit of like yellowish or like pinkish hues, and then you could kind of add that style of wash to the arms, and it'll really give some depth to this figure. I think I might do that just to see how much I could bring out of all the sculpt work in this guy. And of course you can add his mace into his hand. Not too difficult there. Looks pretty good, and that added wrist articulation really lets you like put the weapon in different positions for like some figure photography and posability. Now, I did hear a complaint on some other reviews, and what they were saying was that even if you look at the old Mattel figures, which we'll do right now, he doesn't have any storage on the back for his mace. Now, that's not necessarily true, because if you look at this, if you lift up the bandolero, there's no pegs or anything here, and you can actually slide the part that has the knuckle dusters, the spikes on it, and you could easily slide it under there. And it's kind of weird because it kind of locks itself in there, and then it just fits right in there. And you could store the beta mace in his back without no problem at all. So that way his hand is free, but you still have a kind of storage there. So that's just a little tip from me. So he does kind of have some weapon storage there. You just gotta slide it into the back of the bandolero. Now, another thing I did, so in case you want to have his mace stored here on his back, but you want him to have an extra weapon, I did customize him this like pretty nasty looking knife. It also has some knuckle dusters on there, and you could just slide this onto his hand. I did paint this kind of like in a gold bronze color, and you can put it in his hand and then have it just to add my own little flair to this figure and for him to have another weapon. Pretty cool. Now, he can stand easily on his own, and I'm not playing when I say that. I mean, you could move him around any way you want and he's not gonna fall. He pretty much could stand on his own very simply. Let's go ahead and bring out the old DC Universe Classics Kalibaks. Now, here's the thing about these, and the thing about this is that this comes from a line that was called DC Universe Classics. So basically, a majority, like 90% of the figures that were ever released were like your classic versions of like 80s, 70s, 80s, before the 90s, maybe around the 90s, versions of characters. Now, they did go modern versions sometimes, like the Jaime Reyes Blue Beetle, but they basically stuck to classic versions. Now, that is one of the main differences between these two figures, is that this one has a more like colorful color scheme. It has yellow, a bright red, some greens in there, and this is fine for your classic old version. But as we saw, this Kalibak is actually from the Dark Side War, which is actually a more modern comic take, and this is also comic accurate. It's just not this version of the comics. It's this version, the Dark Side War. So for everybody who prefers this like older, like kind of superpowers, kind of 80s comics version of Kalibak, that's fine. I mean, we had it. Like now to me he's like a little baby toy. Like it just doesn't hold up the way this like statuesque, like super detailed in sculpt work and a more modern articulation just blows this little kid toy out of the water. I mean, it just doesn't do it for me. And you can actually look at him. Let's remove his mace. Let's remove his gun. Now, these little yellow guns actually came with the parademons, but they were actually manufactured to go in Kalibak's belt. He even has a little plug where that goes into. So if you don't have this on your Kalibak, then you're doing it wrong. Now you could take out his club, which is one accessory that did not come with this one. And then we could look at the articulation. Now the head is very limited. I mean, it wiggles around, but it doesn't have any down or up. It doesn't have any really tilt. It just like bobbles around with not really any articulation at all. If you look at the waist, well, first of all, there is no side to sides at the waist at all. This is your old cutout waist that's really ugly and has no lateral movement to speak of. So there's no tilt-a-whirl at the waist where you could move him around. All he really has is this like ugly cut chest, and even that doesn't really have any movement. I mean, basically, if you look at it in a whole, it has the same, even less movement than the McFarlane figure had. So, I mean, you're not really getting anything out of this. And then looking at the arms, I mean, they do have bicep cut, which is nice. They have nicely hinged shoulders. But when you get into the elbow, it's not even like 90 degrees. It's less than 90 degrees. And then if you look at the hands actually swivel with the wrist. So there is no articulation at the hand at all. So even when you put his weapon in his hand, you can't really add any sort of accent or anything to the movement because there's no articulation. And then don't get me started about the legs, because once you open the legs, they have that pretty hideous L cut that DC Universe Classics use, which is pretty much outdated. Now, this guy does have a thigh cut, and it's hidden really well with this like part of his shorts, which I'm a fan of. That's fine. Single jointed knees, up and down at the foot, but of course he has no rocker to speak of and no toe articulation. So those are just more points that McFarlane beats these old Mattel figures in articulation. It's just not, and they don't even really stand very well. Their legs tend to like split apart, so you got to make sure they're like set up to stand. Now I do have the other version of Kalibak. I think this is the more superpowers colored. I do have his little blaster there, and then of course he had that other version of the mace. And then one thing that's rather interesting, if you look at the card that came with this Kalibak, he's actually wearing these colors, like a more brown and tan scheme. So it wouldn't be far-fetched to think that McFarlane is actually going to give us a repainted version of this, but more in this like brown color scheme. So I wouldn't be surprised if that happens. But all in all, these are fun figures to have in your collection. Of course, I have them in my complete DC Universe Classics collection. I have the Dark Side, I have the Desaad, I have the Mr. Miracle. I have all the Fourth World figures that were released from DC Universe Classics. But that's my old collection, and now this is my new collection that I'm building from McFarlane's DC Multiverse. Now, you could get this guy in tons of poses. Like I said before, it's like a statuesque figure that you can actually choose to change any day you like. You could have him in a crouching pose. You could have him in like a strutting pose. You could have him just standing straight up and down. Tons of action poses that you can move him into. It's just what you decide or you feel like having him in that day. But this is an awesome figure. Hope to see more of the Fourth World from McFarlane. Now for some scale of some recent figures, let's go ahead and put him next to my custom Superman. That's your standard sized McFarlane figure. And he pretty much dwarfs this guy. Not necessarily, I mean, even in height, but also in girth. He's like 3 or 4 of these figures side by side. And then let's take a look at another Superman villain that's, you know, kind of a big guy as well, which is Mongol. Now, he's definitely taller than this Kalibak figure, but this guy is more heftier and a lot wider. So he does bring some cool presence to your shelf. Now, he's going to look awesome up there on the shelf. You guys, keep hunting out there, keep collecting, keep customizing, and I will see you on the next one.
They used to call me Crazy Joe, but now they can call me Batman.